Welcome back to MLT 130. In today's lecture, we're going to do an introduction to the endocrine system, and we're also going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. So what is the endocrine system and what does it involve? It is the study of the chemical communication systems that provide the means of control of a huge number of physiological processes. Like other communication networks, the endocrine system contains transmitters, signals, and receivers that are called, respectively, hormone-producing cells and hormones and receptors. So what are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers secreted into the blood or extracellular fluid by one's cells that affect the function of other cells. Most hormones circulate in the blood, coming into contact with essentially all cells. However, a given hormone usually affects only a limited number of cells, which are called target cells. A target cell responds to a hormone because it bears receptors to that hormone. There are three main classes of hormones based on structure. There are steroids, there are polypeptides, and there are amines. And amines are amino acid derivatives. One important topic we need to know the difference between is tropic and non-tropic hormones. When secreted by a gland, some hormones will act on another gland. These are called tropic hormones. Some examples of tropic hormones include TSH, ACTH, LH, and FSH. When these hormones are secreted by a gland and then act directly on a specific target tissue, these hormones are called non-trophic or direct effector hormones. Examples are growth hormones and cortisol. So let's talk about the control of endocrine activity. The physiological effects of hormones depend largely on their concentration in the blood and extracellular fluid. Almost inevitably, disease results when hormone concentrations are either too high or too low. The precise control over circulating concentrations of hormones is therefore crucial. So a little bit too much or a little bit too little hormones can make a big difference in a person. Now we need to learn about the negative and positive feedback control of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus-pituitary hormone axis is regulated by positive and negative loops, which maintain a blood plasma level of concentration in typically a narrow normal range. Remember, the disease results when hormone concentrations are either too high or too low, and that's a very narrow window usually when there's an issue or problem that's happening for a patient as far as hormones or hormone imbalance. So let's talk about the difference between the positive and the negative feedback. Let's start with the negative. The negative feedback is the most common in the endocrine system. The negative feedback is comparable to adjusting a thermostat. If the room is too cold or the temperature is too low, we simply adjust by turning up the heat on the thermostat. So the room being too cold is what triggered us to turn up the heat. So now let's look at an example of what that would look like in the body. And one example that we've already covered is the parathyroid hormone's role in the regulation of plasma calcium levels. If the blood calcium is too low, this triggers the parathyroid gland to secrete increased parathyroid hormone, which in turn breaks down blood cells to release more calcium to the blood, which then brings up the calcium level in the plasma. That's the negative feedback system. Now let's look at the positive feedback system. The presence of a product or signal results in the increase in production or amplification of that product or signal. So let's look at an example now, and our example would be when a woman goes into labor. You have an increased release of oxytocin, which causes an increase in uterine contractions. So that's positive feedback. Now let's talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus gland influences hormones released by the pituitary gland. Sometimes we hear the hypothalamus referred to as the master gland. But more often, we hear the pituitary referred to as the master gland. The pituitary gland has actually two lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Both are the main endocrine glands that influence other glands and target tissues in the body. So that's the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus controls secretions from the anterior pituitary. It secretes hormones called the releasing hormones. On the bottom of the slide are some examples of hypothalamic hormones and how they influence the anti-pituitary gland. First off is TRH, which is the thyrotropin releasing hormone. It stimulates the anti-pituitary to release TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It also does the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anti-pituitary to release LH, which is the luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. Also, the gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the anti-pituitary to release the growth hormone. And then finally, the corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, stimulates the anti-pituitary to release ACTH, which is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which controls the production of cortisol. Okay, for the pituitary, remember it has two lobes. It has the anterior and the posterior. But another name for the anterior lobe of the pituitary is the adenohypophysis. Another name for the posterior lobe is the neurohypophysis. And something to note with the pituitary hormones, some are tropic hormones and some are direct effectors or non-tropic hormones. Direct effector hormones of the pituitary include the growth hormone, or also known as somatotropin. Its secretion is stimulated by the hypothalamic GHRH, or the growth releasing hormone. It's inhibited by somatostatin. Growth hormone levels are diurnal, meaning they have different concentrations at different times of day. Growth hormone is higher at night with sleep, thus a random single measurement has little diagnostic value. More information about growth hormone. Growth hormone is an antagonist to insulin on glucose metabolism. It promotes hepatic gluconeogenesis. Remember, that's the formation of glucagon. And it stimulates lipolysis. Remember, lipolysis is the breakdown of fats or lipids. Growth hormone deficiency in children is associated with hypoglycemia and growth failure. Growth hormone in excess can cause a condition called acromegalia, which occurs in adults. And you can see enlarged bone extremities, especially in the head and in jaw bones. Gigantism is due to increased growth hormone in younger patients before long bone growth is complete. They'll be taller and linear in growth. And you can see an interesting link about Andre the Giant and James Bond's Jaws if you want to go to the link below. Prolactin, or PRL, is secreted by the anterior pituitary, is a direct effector or non-tropic hormone. It affects tissues directly. It helps with lactation or milk production. Excess prolactin can cause hypogonadism or suppressed ovulation in lactating females. And hypogonadism just means a failure of the gonads to function properly, and that can refer to testes or ovaries in men or women. Prolactinoma, which is a pituitary tumor, secretes prolactin. And a prolactinoma usually results in too much prolactin. Now let's talk about trophic hormones of the anterior pituitary. And these are hormones, trophic hormones, that affect other glands. The luteinizing hormone is up first, or LH. It directs testosterone production in men and ovulation in women. FSH is up next, is a follicle-stimulating hormone. Ovarian recruitment and early follicle genesis in women and spermatogenesis in men. Continuing with our trophic hormones for the anterior pituitary, both FSH and LH release are triggered by the secretion of the GnRH, which is the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. TSH, or the thyroid stimulant hormone, is the hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones T4 and T3 into the blood. It is the TRH from the hypothalamus that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release the TSH. Still continuing on with our trophic hormones for the anti-pituitary, our ACTH is secreted from the anti-pituitary due to the release of CRH by the hypothalamus. ACTH regulates adrenal steroidogenesis. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, and cortisol is a steroid hormone. So let's take a minute and do a critical thinking scenario. Now that we have learned about the trophic hormones in the anti-pituitary, let's think about how these are regulated via the negative feedback system. So if your thyroid is underactive and cannot produce enough thyroid hormone, this will trigger the hypothalamus. So we have a problem. So then the hypothalamus will release TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, which then acts on the anti-pituitary to secrete the TSH, or the thyroid stimulating hormone, which will try to get the thyroid gland to ramp up and release more thyroid hormone. See the negative feedback? It's like adjusting a thermostat. So, based on the negative feedback, what should happen if your blood plasma level of cortisol is too low? The negative feedback regulation will trigger the CRH to be released from the hypothalamus. The CRH will then stimulate the anti-pituitary to release ACTH. The ACTH will then stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete more cortisol. Of course, this is in a perfect world, a normal patient, but later on you will learn about conditions affecting the adrenal cortex, so more fun to come. So now let's talk about posterior pituitary hormones. The posterior pituitary secretes two hormones, ADH, also known as vasopressin, and oxytocin. There's a supplemental video on Moodle you could have watched. The hormones of the posterior pituitary are not synthesized in the posterior pituitary. They're made in the hypothalamus, then stored in the posterior pituitary until release is triggered. The release of posterior pituitary hormones is due to a neural trigger. The posterior pituitary hormone, ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is also known as vasopressin, which we mentioned before, and it regulates water excretion by controlling the reabsorption of water, H2O, in the distal tubules, and affects the permeability of the tubules in response to the changes in the osmolality of the blood plasma. An increase in ADH equals a decrease in urine output. A decrease in ADH equals an increase in urine output. Diabetes insipidus is caused by the antidiuretic hormone deficiency, and you see a large urine output or polyuria and increased thirst in patients. And the syndrome of inappropriate ADH is a continuous production of the antidiuretic hormone in absence of a known stimuli. Our last hormone that we're going to cover in this lecture is oxytocin. Of course, it's secreted by the posterior pituitary, and it contributes to uterine contractions in childbirth or labor. Oxytocin also stimulates the epithelial cells surrounding the mammary glands, resulting in milk ejection. This concludes this lecture on the endocrine system. Of course, if you have any questions or need any further clarification, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach me through email or catch me before or after class.